I got married young, and at the time, our aspirations were the same. The older we got, the more it seems we grow apart. I feel like I am the more ambitious one, and he is really content with where he is. There's not necessarily a problem, but it feels really blah. I don't feel like he pushes me. When do you know the difference in making a marriage work versus wanting a different trajectory for life because you only live once?
That's quite a web of interesting questions that come up with longer relationships. Um, One is, how do you negotiate realizing that you're different? Which is probably, if I would say, what is the key issue that couples present with? That, in my mind, is the key central issue that choosing to live in a couple poses to each individual. How do you live with difference? Question number one. Question number two, what do you do with the fact that over time the quality of the relationship changes? And often there's a switch from the excitement of novelty, of getting to know each other, of new material, of finding who you are in the gaze of your partner. There's a lot of really exciting things that happen early in the relationship, and then it changes because you become more familiar. Um, so the kind of blah word, I mean, many people describe that the transition from early to later phases is the transition from wow to blah. The other question is, what happens when certain kind of dynamics unfold and get created when a couple spends a lot of time together, and certain qualities of a relationship gets distributed between the partners and polarized. So one can become indeed more ambitious while the other can become more in favor of, how about we just enjoy the comforts? And those qualities, originally, the people may have not had such an extreme version of those qualities, but the more time they spend together, the more the labor gets distributed more extremely between them. So all of these might be in operation in this like one scenario.
Okay, so establishing how they're different. One, oh, and number two, over time the quality changes, the excitement could die. And number three, different dynamics unfold and they're distributed differently. And maybe one did become more ambitious and one became less.
Yeah.
So all of those factors, I would say the one that's most interesting to me that I would like to ask you about is like establishing that they are different. If they,
Yeah.
what if they weren't different at the beginning and then over time have become different? Is it one of those things where you just communicate and learn to understand the difference because the basis is love, or how does that play out?
That's a really good question, and it might seem sometimes like uh, just like a question of strategy, but it's actually a really, really deep question. Because being confronted with the fact that another person that you're attached to, that you care about, that you depend on, is actually really different from you is actually a shocking event. It might unfold and you might discover it very slowly, but there's a shock value to that difference. Because in a certain way, we all, in this like basic narcissistic way, assume that everyone is like us. And repeatedly, we get surprised and confronted with the fact that people are different. They think differently about the world, they need different things. In fact, with the way they see you, they confront you with the fact that you're different to yourself from what you thought. You thought you're familiar to yourself, but when you get fed back information from the outside, you realize there are qualities in yourself that you haven't even known, that you weren't paying attention to. And those are all disturbing, destabilizing messages, both the difference of the other and the difference we are, how different we are to ourselves. We have an unconscious that presents us with constantly new, surprising material about ourselves. So every time difference gets thrown in our direction, we get destabilized and we start fighting with ourselves or fighting with the other person. I don't want it to be different. I want everything to be the same. I want to feel like I'm in control of my world. I want to feel like I know what's going to happen tomorrow, that it's going to happen exactly the way I want it, the way I expected it, the way I was promised. And a struggle begins. How do we change the thing that seems different? How do we keep everything the same so it feels safe and predictable? And in essence, like the work I do with couples and with individuals is help them, rather than respond defensively to that difference and want to kind of conquer it and make it all same, to learn how to grow from that difference, that that difference is the kind of thorn that will lead to development and will make sure you don't stagnate as a person.
So, okay, that was awesome. So you said people wanted, they do want to control it because it is so unfamiliar, and
Yeah.
they wanted, they don't like change because they do want it to be safe and predictable. So you take that, and I guess it's really uncomfortable. Like that would be really uncomfortable in a relationship, I would assume. And so if the end goal is to grow from the difference, would something you would suggest is that both parties absolutely have to show up as themselves, like their true self? Or is there a little give and take that you say she should give him this or vice versa? Or is it fully like you have to be your most authentic self at this time?
Ah, good questions. Good questions. That's a hard one. That's sort of in a way like the art of therapy. When do you go in what direction? I would say both and,
Mm.
because ultimately you want to show up as your true self and your best self, and negotiate that. On the other hand, you are also asked to consider who your partner is. What's good timing? What can they tolerate? What does it mean to show up as your true self? I remember when years ago when I worked in groups, people would come into group and behave like in very selfish, aggressive ways and claim and completely destabilize the group. But then they would say, "Well, I'm just trying to be my true self."
Mm.
Your true self, great, but how about like think about your impact on other people as well, so that you're taking that into account in terms of like how you present your true self. It's not only about the true self, it's also about like really grasping that there are other people around you, and taking into account their sensibilities, timing, knowing what you know about their history. So it's both and.
Ooh, their history. Okay, that's good too. Wow.
Well, and question with that too, is there a fine line of how much you're supposed to compromise in a relationship? Like how much is this one partner supposed to give versus the other? And what if one is willing to give more than the other? Like where does that balance play?
Yeah, great questions. I think first of all, there's all sorts of compromises. There's a way that you can compromise and still remain honest, and still remain to some degree loyal to your authentic self. But you can compromise in the sense of like really taking into account who your partner is and what they need, and see how much you can stretch yourself. And then there are compromises that are more false, where you're kind of departing from your authentic self and faking it. And that's kind of a time bomb, because that doesn't last. People then develop resentments and rebound. And so if you're going for the honest compromise where you're stretching yourself in favor of the person you love because you see who they are, and you can maintain a connection to your core self, that's growth. That's compromise that will lead to growth, as opposed to compromise that will lead to fakeness.